The terrain alarm. It was the last thing that the pilots of Aeroperu 603 heard. Random horns and alarms sounding for no reason at all, causing many problems on board that flight. Despite the best efforts of the air traffic controller, it was impossible to save the plane. This accident was one of the most avoidable crashes in aviation history. Today, I'm going to tell you the story of how one piece of tape managed to take down a multi-billion-dollar company. This is the story of Aeroperu 603. Let's set the scene. It's the 1990s, and aviation was not really that safe around that decade. Many hijackings and accidents happened in this decade, and if you don't believe me, Swiss Air 111, Egypt 990, PAL 434, Air France 8969, British 5390, and I can continue if you want me to. Although many accidents happened, it was also a great decade as well. The Concorde was still roaming, Airbus was starting to pick up on the market, and many airlines were thriving. And in the country of Peru, it was no different. Aeroperu was a nationally owned airline. Although not many people know about it, it was safe and reliable, and had a pretty good safety record. However, during the night of October 1996, it will all come crashing down. In Miami International Airport, it was a calm night. The weather was clear and the traffic was decent. A flight from Miami to Santiago was getting ready to taxi onto runway 15, ready for departure. The flight had 61 passengers and 9 crew members. The plane was a Boeing 757, known for its safety and reliability. The pilots of the flight was the most professional pilots in the airline, Captain Eric Shriver and First Officer David Fernandez. They both had more than 30,000 flight hours in their hands. As you can say, they are very experienced. At 5:42 UTC, an Aeroperu 603 took off for Santiago. It was a normal climb. However, when the captain put the gear up, the plane's altimeter was stuck. For the people who don't know, altimeters are computers that measure how high your plane is flying. The altimeters read 0, but the plane was still airborne. Just as they were comprehending the situation, they lost another important data, the speed indicator, that helps measure the plane's speed. Without any of those two data, they were like driving a car blindfolded. Both pilots first maintained speed, then contacted air traffic control for guidance. The pilots now had an alarm called the rudder ratio, which is an alarm saying that they lost a few rudder controls for the tail of the plane. Suddenly, the altimeter came back online, so the pilots started climbing to a higher altitude. Everything on the flight computers were now back in working order somehow. But this moment will be briefed. The captain tried to engage the autopilot to give them time to think. However, the readings from the flight's computer were so erratic, the autopilot disengaged. A few moments after thinking, they get another warning called MACH trim, which is an alarm that tells pilots that their plane is not at the right altitude, but they were flying normally. Another warning then came, which is an overspeed warning. The pilots did not know if they could trust the flight computers. If the warning was true, the plane would go at an insane speeds and could tear the plane apart. The first officer called in air traffic control and declared an emergency and requests altitude and speed information. The air traffic controller tells them to change their radar frequency and ILS on the airport so that the air traffic control could see their altitude and speed. The air traffic controller tells them they were at 4,000 feet. However, the air traffic controller didn't know that the information he's getting was from the plane's incorrect flight computer. The first officer tries to see if there's any explanation in any checklist at all, but to no results. With a lot of alarms and horns in the cockpit, the pilots did not notice that their plane was descending. Their pilots were now very desperate. Their speed kept being incorrect and they can't fully trust on their flight computers. They tried to use many tactics like speed braking and idle engines, but then the computers burst down multiple warnings at the same time. The weirdest alarm were the overspeed and the stall warning. An overspeed is an alarm saying the plane was too fast, and a stall warning means the plane was rapidly losing speed. Both alarms were somehow alerting together. They tried their last desperate attempt. They called in air traffic control to call in a Boeing 707 to guide them to the nearest airport. The air traffic controller did alert a Boeing 707 and it was taxiing on the runway, but that won't help them. Now, the pilots would get an alarm that would send shivers down any pilot's spine, the terrain alarm. It is an alarm that tells the pilots that they were too close to the ground for comfort. The air traffic control radar showed the plane was still on 10,000 feet. The pilots did not know which to trust, the plane's computer or the air traffic controller. But after more desperate moves, the terrain alarm was right. The plane's left wingtip slashed the water. The plane then returned back to the air, but then nosedived into the ocean below. None of the 70 people on board survived. Air traffic control calls the flight 3 more times before he knew that it was the end. The investigation was actually quite slow at first. One of the main investigators was personally attached to the first officer. The first officer was his nephew. Other investigators thought of removing him from the investigation. However, their thoughts were out of the window, as in his words,
So I feel very bad, but I'm a professional and I have to do a job. I have to comply and complete my duty. So that's what I did.
Once the investigators started to dive into the cockpit voice recorder, they immediately thought of mechanical failures, as no way all those warnings could have started at once. Disclaimer, the following is the actual cockpit voice recorder, and if you're sensitive to these type of stuff, don't listen.
Too low terrain.
You can hear all the alarms in the backgrounds and the panic in the pilot's voice. The investigators soon came to the focus on the flight computers. To understand this, you have to know about how flight computers works. Outside the plane, as shown on this Boeing 737, there is a small tube poking out here. These are called static ports. They suck in information to the flight computers and generate data. These static ports must be protected during maintenance, as it might cause damage. They use duct tape to cover the static ports. So the investigators used underwater robotic vehicles to find more of the wreckage. What they found was completely chilling. They found out that tape was still stuck on the static ports and was not removed. Without more evidence of any other situation, this was the official cause of Aeroperu 603. Many of the family members sued Aeroperu for the way their loved ones died. They were alive until the nosedive, which they all drowned. The engineer that taped the static port was imprisoned for his mistake. Aeroperu, the national airline, went bankrupt in 1999. And this is how one piece of tape managed to bring down a massive plane and a multi-million-dollar